How different would things look for BYU had Kyle Whittingham taken the Tennessee job back in 2010? Would Kalani Sitake still be at BYU? Would Bronco Mendenhall be at BYU still? There's a lot of hypotheticals, and we're going to dig into all of them on a crossover edition with Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you may get your podcast. If this is your first time listening to either of our shows, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in the YouTube comments, as well as on social media. We can follow our show at Locked On Utes on X or Locked On Cougars on X as well. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to be joined by Jake Hatch, the host of Locked On Cougars. And Jake, this was something that I don't think either of us planned on talking about for our Friday show. We both kind of texted each other last minute, looking at each other like, wait, what in the world almost happened? Because there were reports back in 2010 that Kyle Whittingham, who at the time, Kalani Sitake was his defensive coordinator, had offered and talked to Tennessee, all of that, but it never really seemed that serious. But Kalani Sitake recently pulled back the curtain and let everyone know it really was that serious at one point.
Well, and that's the thing about this is, I remember the stories coming out that Kyle was in the mix for the Tennessee job. And this was just months before Utah found out they were going to the Pac-12. Mm-hmm. So this is a period of time that had a whole lot of news in it, obviously. But I do remember back in 2010 that there were rumors that Kyle was in the mix to potentially make that leap to Tennessee. Remember, they just come off the 2008 Sugar Bowl and things where they were riding high in the Mountain West Conference. It seemed like really what else could Kyle Whittingham accomplish at Utah? Well, 10, 15 years later, he's accomplished quite a bit. But nonetheless, at that point, you're wondering how high of a ceiling they truly had. And he decided that he was going to look at that job. But for Kalani to get up, this was during the Kidney Foundation golf tournament they are obviously part of each year, raises money for the Utah and Idaho chapters of the Kidney Foundation out here in the Western United States, is that Kalani said that they were very, very close. They were like having conversations like, hey, we're doing this thing right. And then according to what Kalani said, is about 1 a.m, the night before what was going to be made, Kyle called him and said, you know what, let's stick it out here in Utah. But we're going to get into this. Imagine what might be the state of this rivalry, the state of football in the state of Utah, had both Kalani and Kyle opted to go to Rocky Top.
Oh, it's drastic. And it's like you said, we'll have to talk about that more in a second. But I think some people listen to this and they might be like, how in the world could Kyle Whittingham ever considered leaving Utah? You know, Kalani Sitake saying just having the ties to Utah and obviously just the BYU, the strong connection to the state itself. Why would you leave? Well, Tennessee's a pretty nice job. And if we look at the time around when this happened, 2010, so this is after Philip Fulmer had just left. Obviously, such a great coach. I still remember the blind side. It's like that's the benchmark of Philip Fulmer where Nick Saban and all these SEC coaches walk into a room and then Phil Fulmer walks in and everyone goes, oh, we're done. We lost that. Like, that's what Tennessee was. But then Fulmer left, and they only had Lane Kiffin for 1 year. 2009 was the only year Kiffin was there, and then he left. And Kiffin was this obviously hotshot, young, rising coach, and it was like, well, this is a guy who's going to be bouncing around all over the place. We want some stability. It doesn't get much more stable than Kyle Whittingham. So I think that's where you see why Tennessee was so interested in Kyle Whittingham. And look, I don't know what he was offered, but an SEC paycheck talks. And obviously, if you want Kyle Whittingham, you want his staff to come with him too. So it sounds like Kalani Sitake would have been very well compensated too. And they would have been a package deal.
Yeah, and that's the way it sounded like, because Kalani was the one that kind of lifted the lid on all of this. And Kyle Whittingham, if you read the story, essentially, nodded and said, that's how it went down. So it's absolutely incredible to consider both of those guys ending up at the SEC, doing what they potentially could have done at Tennessee. And it's such a wild thought in my mind to see Kyle Whittingham wearing orange and Kalani wearing orange for that matter. But apparently it was closer than literally any of us. I don't think any of the quote unquote insiders at that time even knew how close it was. The stories were out there. Obviously there was interest, but to be talking about, hey, we need to start looking potentially for houses and what we're going to do in terms of selling our stuff here in Utah. Those were the conversations that were happening. And that's about as close as it gets before you renege on an opportunity like that.
Yeah, it's wild to think how close to the finish line it actually sounds like it did God. A lot of the details from the story that we're going to be recounting come from Jay Drew's piece at thedeseretnews.com. And you mentioned this a little bit, right? But the phone call, the let's stay and make it awesome here at Utah. Because, as you also discussed, Jake, this is a time where Utah was transitioning into the Pac-12. There are lots of programs that when they change conferences, that does not go well for them. So it's another reason why they looked at it like we can get compensated well in Tennessee. They have a strong tradition and history of winning. There were a lot of, I know they're Rocky Top, like you said, not the same rocks and valleys as Utah, but they had a strong history and tradition of winning down there too. So there's a lot of reasons to make this move. But, we look back on that quote, right? Let's stay here in Utah and make it awesome. And I think both Kyle Whittingham and a lot of things that Kalani Sitake has accomplished too, they've stayed here and made it awesome.
Well, and that's the other thing about this is, let's say Kyle Whittingham, had he taken the Tennessee job, then the Pac-12 is looking around, the Pac-10 at the time is looking around for conference expansion. If Utah is without the kind of the architect of what that program was at that point, if he had left for Tennessee at that point, does the Pac-12 say thanks but no thanks to Utah? Do they look elsewhere? Do they go take somebody else? That's the interesting part about this, is because this is happening literally months before the Pac finally decided to add Utah and Colorado to the mix. And to consider, if Kyle had left at that point, that absolutely could have thrown everything for a loop on that side of it. And very well could have been that both BYU and Utah are still in the Mountain West, maybe to this day, or maybe both of them maybe make the jump to Big 12 in the last couple of years based on how conference realignment went with BYU getting in when they did. There's just a whole like kind of revisionist history or like a alternate timeline out there in the multiverse as it is that had that happen, what ultimately becomes of the Utah BYU rivalry and where they're at currently in this day.
Yeah, I mean, if Utah doesn't have the recent success that they're on, let's say Kyle Whittingham, and we'll do even more what if soon, but let's say Kyle Whittingham left for Tennessee. Like, if Utah doesn't have the recent success they've had, who's to say Utah's not Washington State, Oregon State? And you make a good point, Jake. Maybe they do get in on the Big 12 expansion pack, because a lot of those teams, BYU, a lot of those were able to do that without winning conference champions per se, but it's far from a guarantee. Like, Utah is where they are today as a program, like, because of two words, Kyle Whittingham.
No doubt about that. And that's the thing about it, is it's just incredible to consider what ultimately might have played out had that happened. But the other thing about it is there is some thought that Kalani, had he gone to Tennessee, he's always talked about BYU being his dream job. And I mean, there are Cougar fans out there that I would agree with them that even had he gone to Tennessee and that, let's say, Bronco Mendenhall still leaves BYU in 2015, I still firmly believe that Kalani Sitake would be at or near the top of BYU's wish list, just because there's not a lot of candidates out there in the world for BYU, because you have to have a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to man that job. So there's still a reality in my mind that had all this gone down, that Kalani Sitake probably leaves Tennessee to come back to BYU, or maybe he opted to go with Gary Anderson maybe earlier on at Tennessee, he goes to Oregon State, whatever. The whole scenario here is insane to consider, but looking at it, there is a lot of what ifs. Had this happened, had that happened. I still think, though, Kalani Sitake, if that timeline had played out, I still got a thought in my head that Kalani Sitake would still be the BYU head coach at this point, even had that scenario played out.
That's a fair thought, but it's also an assumption that Kyle Whittingham would have worked at Tennessee and that Kalani Sitake and then we're crushing it down there for the Vols. So would that have been the case? What would Utah have done? Would BYU still have gotten Sitake? Would the rivalry be different? The recent history, yes, BYU won the last one, but the recent history has been on Utah's side overall. Would BYU instead have dominated the rivalry? Time to dive into the multiverse in a moment with all of those crazy possibilities. Want to talk to you all about the sponsor of our episode of this Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars crossover. It's our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. You can keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Jake, we mentioned the several hypotheticals for you. If Kyle Whittingham, let's dive into all the madness. Kyle Whittingham leaves to Tennessee in 2010. What is the craziest potential what-if scenario to you about that happening?
Kalani Sitake is Utah's head coach right now. I honestly, here's the thing about that. Like, I know that Kalani talked about the fact that he looked like he was going to go with Kyle to Tennessee, but I can tell you that Chris Hill, he would have made an absolutely insane offer to Kalani Sitake to remain at Utah as Utah's head coach at that point. I think personally, because you just think about it, you want some continuity there, and at that point, Kalani's probably the closest thing to it. Now, the other scenario is maybe you turn around and try and lure Gary Anderson back from Utah State because he left to Logan just before this. So there's that scenario. But the whole thought process that had this played out, maybe Kalani Sitake is a decade into his career as Utah's head coach versus being at BYU.
Oh, that's just so crazy to think about with the way the fan bases obviously talk about the other coach, which is it's funny because we're going to talk about at the end how actually both coaches obviously loves each other because they have these fun interactions. I'm glad it's funny how they can have these kind of rivalry talks versus there's so many other I mean, Ryan Day and Jim Harbaugh, that's no secret. Those two just straight up didn't like each other. And I'm sure maybe the fan base has preserved it that way, but I think it's a lot of fun this way. And I'm so glad you brought up Gary Henderson. That is exactly who I was going to go with. And you make a good point that Kalani may have still been the guy, but the way he was talking, it just made it seem like they were going to go together. And, sometimes you just need a little bit more time too. Like maybe Kalani just wouldn't have been considered yet because he didn't have as much experience. Maybe it needed to happen a few more years later. Obviously, Kalani's done a great job. I think he's done a great job at BYU. I think he's going to continue to do a good job there. But Gary Anderson is the name I look at. And because he, like you said, he was at Utah State, but I think they would have tried to lure him back. It would have been really interesting to see how it would have all gone over then, because it is not what Kyle Whittingham has done for Utah. I mean, it's been incredible. The job he's done guiding them from the Mountain West to the Pac-12 to a premier Pac-12 program to now hopefully Big 12 prominence. It's incredibly challenging, and it's been a long process for Utah. They made Pac-12 championships early on, but it's hard to break through and actually beat, hey, can you get through Oregon? Can you get through USC? And Utah was finally able to do that. And that was a large part because of Kyle Whittingham. And because Kyle Whittingham was able to break through, Jake, I don't know about you, I think he would have been successful at Tennessee. I'm not saying they would have beaten Alabama and the things of that nature, but I think if Tennessee had hired Kyle Whittingham, I'm going to go as far to say is he would still be their head coach today if they had made that move. And Kalani would have only been with him for a few seasons, because I agree with you, whether it was Utah hiring him right away or BYU shortly after. I just think Kyle Whittingham with Kalani Sitake, they were successful at Utah. I think they would have been successful down at Tennessee too. Kyle's
got a proven formula for success. There's no doubt about that. It would work anywhere. You could take him, I think, to USC. You could take him to Oregon State. You could take him to Yale. I don't care where you take him. His system would work, and it would have worked at Tennessee in my mind. And I'm with you. The crazy thing about it is, though, as hyper competitive as the SEC is, here's the deal. Had he had success at Tennessee, who's to say that an Auburn, Bama at this point, like one of those bigger fish. I know that Tennessee's a big fish, but one of the bigger fish in the SEC, maybe they come with just a back up the Brinks truck type offer, and Kyle Whittingham's the head coach of one of those other SEC programs. That's the incredible thing to think about this, because I think Kyle Whittingham, he's got a proven formula for success. The nice part is he's shown that to be true, because guys like Gary Anderson, I know Gary Anderson flamed out at a couple of his stops, and obviously he's not in the coaching realm right now. He's helping actually out at BYU as a consultant, but Kalani is borrowed heavily from what Kyle's formula was, and for everything that Kalani is, he's had fairly decent success at BYU, kind of building on that. So I think that there's a formula for success, and had that gone down, I think Kyle's probably still in the SEC, or maybe somebody like a USC. He's a Western guy. He was born in LA because his dad was coaching down there with the Rams at the time. Maybe USC would have come after him, because there's been rumors about USC going after him at multiple points in the Pac-12 era. So maybe had that all gone down, he could have ended up being at a USC or something like that. But the formula for success, it's really, I think it's very translatable across the sport.
Hey, based on how it's played out lately, maybe USC wishes they did go after Kyle Whittingham instead of someone else who's up and over there right now. May not have the Heisman trophies, but maybe would win a little more. But that's a conversation for another show. But I do want to say about Kyle Whittingham, it's just crazy to think like the path you were describing is the Urban Meyer path, right? Yes. Bouncing around and then moving up until you get to a program that is of that caliber, where it's like the tradition outside of just you is winning at the biggest stage, which yes, and Utah's had success with other coaches, but it's just like the beating Alabama, the back-to-back Pac-12 championships. Like Utah is Kyle Whittingham, obviously, for everything they've done. And because Utah is Kyle Whittingham, it's hard not to wonder, okay, let's say Gary Anderson's the guy at Utah, maybe, and he's flamed out other places. So who knows how that works? Does that mean instead of Utah having won more recent games in the Holy War rivalry recently, does BYU actually take control of it because Utah doesn't have Kyle Whittingham services, Jake?
Well, and that's the thing about this is how what level are these two programs at that point? Now, 2010 BYU was still rolling pretty strong. Remember that from 06 to 09, BYU won. It was north of 40 some odd games. They were routinely putting out 11-win seasons, and even that 2010 season, if I recall correctly, it might have been a 10-3 record that year. It might have been a little bit less, or maybe it was 8-5. But regardless, very, very competitive under Bronco Mendenhall at that point. And Bronco, I think, for everything that he was not happy with the fact that BYU was not a Power 5 conference when his arch rival Utah was. So obviously that was a big part of it. But at the same time, I think he understood that the disparity in the two programs was too much for him in his mind to overcome. So he ultimately opted to make a jump to the Power 5 himself, go to Virginia, and he had success at the ACC level. And so that obviously went well for him. But I think had these two programs maybe stayed on more of an even footing at that point, if Utah doesn't get the invite to the Pac-12 and BYU is okay to stick around in the Mountain West alongside the Utes, I think it might have been a more balanced rivalry at that point. The thing about it is when Utah started getting those Power 5 level players in bunches, it really tilted the rivalry in their favor. And I know there's going to be BYU fans watching saying, "Oh, Jake, shut up. Stop talking." It's true. It's absolutely the truth. The thing about it is BYU has been more competitive as they've started to recruit better under Kalani Sitake. Now, we'll find out how the rivalry goes this fall, and that's obviously a conversation for another podcast. But the thing is, had they stayed on an even, more of an even or level playing field, I think that rivalry is much more even at very minimum, and more than likely BYU maybe has more wins than Utah does over the previous decade, because you just don't know what a Gary Anderson or Kalani Sitake led Utah program looks like. We knew what BYU looked like under Bronco Mendenhall, and that was a hard-nosed team that was winning a bunch of games in that era.
There are programs that have spent their entire existence chasing a Kyle Whittingham type. So for you to say it could have been even, or even BYU instead being the one dominating, is not at all insane, because that is the type of presence that Kyle Whittingham has brought to Utah, is the consistency and all of that. And it's why I think they have a great chance right away to walk in and win the Big 12. And it's just going to be fantastic to see how it plays out this fall. Jake, you know what my biggest regret of this entire story is, though, that we didn't get to see, is Kyle Whittingham doing his Brian Kelly in some SEC stadium. It's a great day to be a Vol in his Southern accent. Kalani actually joked that he had been practicing his Southern accent. I couldn't even imagine like them trying to adopt and all the different things, because there's a lot you have to do if you want to be a coach at the SEC too. You got to kind of fit into their mold versus what was able to establish it at Utah.
Okay, here's the thing. Kyle Whittingham, for everything that he is, yes, he would have adopted to how things operated in the SEC. I get that. But I will say one thing. Kyle Whittingham would have never put on a fake Southern drawl to try and entice his fan base. Brian Kelly, I don't know what he was thinking with that, and that wouldn't have happened. Kalani may have tried it out on somebody just to have a joke with it, but I can tell you, Kyle Whittingham, that's not his MO, so that would not have been a thing. But there have been a lot of other things I think Kyle would have been willing to do, but that is one of those I think he would have drawn a line in the sand, said, I'm not crossing that line.
I agree. And like we both said, we think Tennessee would have been better off for it. Utah would have been worse off. BYU would be in, if Kalani had left to go to Tennessee too, it feels like they still would have been in a similar, if not better situation, potentially due to Utah's downfall and them still probably ending up with Kalani Sitake. So, yeah.
Here's the thing. Bronco Mendenhall might still be BYU's head coach at this point, had this all gone down. Utah. Like if Utah doesn't go into the Pac-12 and BYU doesn't feel like they're forced to go into independence to get the money that they wanted and the exposure they wanted, well, Bronco was not happy with independent status at all. Maybe they stake around in the Mountain West Conference. Maybe to this day, Bronco Mendenhall is still BYU's head coach. He'd be going on 20 years at that point, but he had a proven track record of success, and there's no reason you would have thrown him out the door. He had to leave of his own volition. You were not going to fire that guy. So that's the interesting part about this. Bronco might still be in Provo giving us all of his Broncoisms that we like to talk about for all those years, but that very well could have been the scenario that would have played out.
It's a wild what if, and thankfully one that Utah fans will not have to experience, because life without Kyle Whittingham, even though it will soon be a reality, is not one that I'm glad I've had to know for the past few years as a Utah fan. But one reality about Kyle Whittingham and Kalani Sitake that's been highlighted the entire time we've had this conversation, and if you read the story by Jay Drew, is their relationship. And it's funny because you can even scroll down on the story. It's available on the Deseret News. And you see the two of them sitting down at the country club. This was back, it was Sunday, the Hidden Valley Country Club in Sandy. And this was June 13th, 2016 is where the photo is from. It's the two of them sitting, talking, and laughing. But even the fact that they had this conversation, right? And like they're joking about it in the past, like, oh, we just talked about it last week, like showing the fact that they talk about it. Utah and BYU fans can drive each other absolutely nuts, Jake. These guys are like great friends. It's absolutely hilarious, the negativity we have that goes on where both sides can't stand each other and all these two things, and it's not even close to shared by the head coaches.
No, it's not. These are two guys that are very, very close. Obviously, Kyle plucked Kalani from Southern Utah and brought him onto the Utah staff. And really, I think outside of Lavelle Edwards, I think if you ask Kalani, Kyle Whittingham is the chief mentor of his as a coach. He learned so many things at the feet of Kyle Whittingham, and a lot of those things came from Fred Whittingham and Lavelle Edwards that Kyle has carried forward into his coaching career. So yeah, they are very, very close. They still talk often, as I understand it, and that's the thing about this. There was a fairly frosty relationship between Bronco and Kyle. They just did not see eye to eye on things, and Bronco said some things that made Utah and Kyle Whittingham mad. Kyle Whittingham in turn said some things about BYU that had Bronco Mendenhall and the Cougars that were upset. This relationship, though, this is more of the Lavelle Edwards, Ron McBride era Utah BYU rivalry where, yeah, they are fierce rivals on the field. There's no doubt about that. But their coaches, they're very, very close. They're good friends. And I think that all of the fan bases on both sides can learn a thing or two from it.
Absolutely. And yes, we all have fun. Like they love competing against each other. It's the same thing as you hear any athlete ask about when they play their teammate or their brother or sibling on the other team. Like they want to do nothing more than beat them. But at the end of the day, like they're still family. And obviously not everyone is related to each other. We're not saying that. But at the end of the day, it is a matter of things like, I know there are people who don't get excited about this game because of the negative discourse around it. And that's sad. Like this is supposed to be the coaches. They're going to get fired up about this because it's an opportunity for bragging rights and all those type of things. So like next year at this time, when they go to this charity event, one of them is making a joke about how they beat the other. And that's what makes it fun, is that they do hang out together in the off season and all the course of things of that nature. So I would love for us to get to a point in this rivalry. It will never be universal because it is the internet in 2024, but it would be great if we got to a point where we were much more like Kalani Sitake and Kyle Whittingham, or I'll even say JT Wistrcill, Jake Hatch.
That's a good point. That's a very good point there, my friend. That's the thing about this is it is a fun rivalry. There's no doubt about that. Trust me, I have built a career in many respects off of this rivalry because I do it in radio. I do it on my podcast.
Go to this show.
Yeah, like that's the thing about this is there is a back and forth between these two fan bases that make it, I think, truthfully, the best rivalry in the Big 12. I don't care about any of the old school rivalries. I know you have Farmageddon out there. I know the battle for the Sunflower State. I know you got the Territorial Cup coming in with Arizona and Arizona State joining the league. Sorry. Holy War beats the pants off of all of them every day and twice on Sunday. It is a 365, 24/7 rivalry. And that's the thing about it is it exists in all things. And it is fun. It is something that I think a lot of people may get a little bit stressed out over. But if you can look at it for what it is, it's a sporting event. It's not life or death. Life goes on after this game goes. Yes, you may have to endure some cat calls and some mild ribbing, or maybe some bigger ribbing from people that on either side, depending on who wins the game. But just enjoy it for what it is. It's an elite rivalry in a sport that has had a lot of those rivalries ruined due to realignment. Now, realignment has brought some of them back together, like this one, so it's obviously great to have that. But enjoy it for what it is, because it has survived Utah leading for the Power 5, BYU going independent, them not playing every year for a stretch that they haven't played. That's the thing about it, is it endured all of that. And the good news is it's back together. They're playing November 9th, and we all can get behind that and have some fun in the lead up to it.
It's going to be such a blast. You and I will definitely be doing more of these shows, previewing the matchup. And, Utah and BYU are competing for an elite basketball play even right now. They're literally the number one player overall in the country, potentially, with some recent developments there. So it'll extend even beyond football. It's going to be a great season coming up. Just like Jake, it's always great having you on here. Make sure you guys give Jake a follow at Jacob C. Hatch. Obviously, those of you Locked On Cougar fans, that won't be a problem. But for those of you who are Locked On Utes, I want to make sure you guys do as well.
Okay. AJ DeBonsa, keep an eye on that kid, folks. He is going to be playing here locally. Utah BYU fans, keen eye. It's going to be in Hurricane, so it's a little bit further south than a lot of you are used to paying attention to, but he is truthfully the top prospect in the entire country, and he's calling Utah home for the next upcoming basketball season. He's got offers from both the Utes and the Cougars. It will be interesting to see if he can be won over by either program, but it's one absolutely to keep an eye on.
It is. Both have connections to him basically now too. So I can't wait to watch the battle of that play out. We obviously can't wait till the battle for the Holy War too. Jake, always fun doing these with you, my friend.
Thanks for having me as always.
That's going to do it for today's Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars crossover, but we'll both be back with you next week talking more things Utah and BYU football.